There are moments in history when events seem to follow a predictable course. Changes happen slowly, institutions remain relatively stable, the economy finds ways to reorganize itself, and society, even when facing challenges, continues moving forward within familiar patterns. Then, almost without warning, a period arrives when everything starts to change at the same time. It's as if several pieces of a huge puzzle were being moved simultaneously, creating a sense that the world has entered a completely different phase from the one we knew. That was exactly the impression I had when I decided to analyze this period more deeply. I confess that even before opening the charts and examining each configuration, I already had the feeling that we were living through an unusual moment. Not just because of the news that arrives every day, nor because of the crises that appear in different parts of the planet, but because there is a pattern that keeps repeating itself in completely different areas. Technology advancing at an astonishing speed, international disputes taking on new forms, economies being forced to reinvent themselves, traditional alliances weakening, and a growing sense that old certainties no longer offer the same security as before. When such different phenomena start happening at the same time, it's hardly just a matter of coincidence. It was precisely this sequence of events that sparked my curiosity. Instead of analyzing just a single isolated event, I decided to look at the bigger picture. The question that guided this investigation was very simple, but at the same time extremely important. Are we just going through yet another turbulent phase in history, or is there something bigger happening behind all of this? Because they are different questions. A crisis passes, but a historical cycle transforms the way humanity lives for decades. As I delved deeper into this analysis, one characteristic started to appear repeatedly. What caught my attention the most was not the possibility of a specific event, but the number of different areas that seemed to be moving in the same direction. When similar changes start to appear in politics, the economy, technology, international relations, and even in people's behavior, this usually indicates that we are not dealing with isolated problems. We are witnessing a structural transformation, the kind that changes the way an entire society functions. This type of movement is usually quiet at first. At first, small signs appear that many people ignore. Then, seemingly disconnected events start to happen. Only sometime later do we realize that all those episodes were part of a single, much larger change. History shows that major transitions almost never begin with a single dramatic event. They begin when several smaller events start to point in the same direction, even if most people can't see this connection while it's happening. Perhaps this is exactly the most important point of this analysis. Many people look for predictions hoping to hear dates, names, or specific events. However, before any major event takes place, there is usually an environment that makes that event possible. No historical transformation arises out of nowhere. Before it happens, the stage is already being slowly set. Tensions rise, old structures lose efficiency, new models begin to appear, and almost without noticing, reality stops working the way it did a few years before. Observing this period, I got the impression that we are precisely in this intermediate phase. We still coexist with traditional institutions, familiar economic models, and forms of organization that have dominated much of the past decades. However, at the same time, new forces are emerging to compete for space, new technologies are altering power relations, and new behaviors are challenging what for a long time seemed definitive. It's like watching two different eras coexist at the same time, while one of them slowly begins to replace the other. Another aspect that deserves attention is the speed at which these changes are happening. In other historical periods, similar transformations took decades to produce visible effects. Today, thanks to the speed of information, technology, and global communication, events that once would have taken years to have an impact can alter markets, governments, or international relations in a matter of days. This acceleration doesn't necessarily mean that everything will become more chaotic, but it does indicate that the consequences of decisions made from now on could be much faster and deeper than we were used to seeing. While analyzing this set of signals, what also caught my attention was the number of sectors that seemed to be undergoing a kind of complete overhaul. Economic models that were once considered unquestionable are now starting to be challenged. Technologies that just a few years ago seemed experimental now influence decisions made by governments and large companies. Artificial intelligence is no longer just a novelty and is starting to occupy strategic spaces. At the same time, the competition for resources, international influence, and control of information is intensifying. When so many important areas undergo transformation simultaneously, it's unlikely that we're just talking about a sequence of independent events. There is also a human element that often goes unnoticed. In times of great change, it's not just institutions that transform, people change as well. Values once considered absolute begin to be questioned. Personal priorities shift. The way we work, consume, communicate, and even build relationships undergoes profound revisions. In other words, it's not just the external world that goes through a transition. The very way each individual interprets reality also begins to change. That is precisely why I consider this one of the most important periods to be analyzed calmly. Not because I believe that a single event will define the future of humanity, but because the signs we observe suggest something much more interesting. They indicate that we are witnessing the gradual birth of a new historical cycle. And when a new cycle begins, we don't always immediately perceive its true significance. Often, it is only years later that we understand we lived through the very moment when old structures began to disappear and new forms of organization started to take shape. This realization completely changes the way we look at the daily news. Instead of seeing only isolated facts, we start looking for connections. Instead of asking only what happened, we begin to ask, why are so many different events pointing in the same direction? It is precisely this question that will continue to guide this entire analysis, because if these signs are truly part of a much larger transformation, understanding the pattern behind them may be far more important than simply trying to predict the next event. One of the greatest illusions we tend to nurture is believing that institutions, economic systems, international alliances, and models of power remain unshakable simply because they have survived for many years. History shows exactly the opposite. The more solid a structure appears, the greater the impact tends to be when it starts to show signs of wear. And it was precisely this aspect that caught my attention the most during this analysis. I didn't just find signs of change. I found evidence that several pillars which have supported much of the past decades may be simultaneously entering a process of revision. This does not mean that we will see an immediate collapse of governments, economies, or organizations. Major transformations rarely happen that way. They begin when systems that have functioned predictably for a long time start to struggle to respond to the challenges of a completely new reality. The problem is not just in the events themselves. The problem arises when the tools created to solve past crises are no longer sufficient to face unprecedented challenges. Perhaps that's exactly why so many people have the feeling that something has changed, even if they can't explain what it is. Observe the international scenario. In different regions of the world, traditional alliances are constantly being tested. Countries that for decades maintained relatively stable positions are beginning to redefine their strategic priorities. New economic blocs are gaining importance while former leaders face both internal and external challenges. When we look at each piece of news in isolation, everything seems like just another political episode. But when we look at the whole picture, we notice a much broader pattern. This pattern reveals an interesting characteristic. Instead of a single power concentrating most of the world's influence, a more fragmented scenario is beginning to emerge, in which different countries seek to expand their autonomy and reduce dependencies that once seemed inevitable. This movement is changing trade negotiations, military agreements, international investments, and even technological development. It's not just about competition between nations. It's about a gradual reorganization of the global balance. At the same time as this is happening on the international stage, another phenomenon is quietly advancing: the transformation of the relationship between governments and technology. For a long time, a country's strength was measured mainly by its territory, its natural resources, or its military power. Today, these factors remain important, but they now share space with something much less visible and extremely powerful: the control of information. Those who control technology, artificial intelligence, digital infrastructure, semiconductor production, communication, and data processing come to wield an influence that often surpasses even traditional economic power. This shift in power brings about profound consequences. Private companies begin to exert influence comparable to that of some governments. Digital platforms become strategic tools. The race for innovation is no longer just a commercial matter and becomes part of the national security of several countries. When we analyze this set of developments, we realize that we are not simply witnessing a technological evolution, we are witnessing the birth of a new form of international power. While these changes are happening on the surface, another equally important process is taking place behind the scenes. Economic models that dominated the global landscape for decades are beginning to face increasingly evident limitations. This does not necessarily mean they will cease to exist, but it is possible to notice a growing effort to find alternatives capable of responding to challenges that previously simply were not part of reality. Issues related to production, logistics, global supply chains, spiritual energy, and economic security have come to occupy the center of strategic decision-making in many countries. This shift in priorities reveals something interesting. For many years, efficiency was practically the only concern. Today, resilience is starting to gain ground. In other words, it's not enough to produce more cheaply. It's necessary to ensure stability in the face of an increasingly unpredictable world. This change in mindset may seem subtle, but it represents a profound shift in the way governments and companies plan for the future. Another aspect that deserves attention is the growing difficulty major institutions face in maintaining the same level of public trust they once had. Regardless of the country or political orientation, a recurring phenomenon can be observed. Citizens are increasingly questioning authorities, experts, companies, international organizations, and even traditional media outlets. This process does not necessarily mean that all these institutions are wrong, but it does indicate an important change in the relationship between information and credibility. Trust, which was once almost automatic, now depends on transparency, concrete results, and the ability to adapt. This environment creates an extremely challenging scenario. On one hand, the need for stability is growing. On the other hand, the pressure for change is increasing. The greater this tension, the higher the likelihood that we will see profound reforms emerging in sectors that have remained virtually untouched for a long time. Education, health, economy, security, spiritual energy, transportation, and communication may undergo transformations that still seem distant today, but are slowly beginning to be prepared. There is also an important psychological factor. Whenever a society goes through periods of transition, people tend to seek out references that can offer security. Some try to preserve old models, while others fully embrace the new. The result is usually a period marked by intense debates about which path to follow. Not because there is necessarily a single answer, but because different visions of the future begin to compete for space at the same time. This kind of dispute does not happen only between governments or large organizations. It reaches companies, families, and even individual decisions. Professions disappear while others emerge rapidly. Business models stop working. Traditional ways of consuming information change. The very concept of work continues to be redefined by technology and new social demands. In other words, what today seems to be merely an economic change may in fact represent a much deeper transformation in the way society organizes its very existence. It was precisely this set of signs that led me to conclude that we are not just witnessing a succession of independent crises. We are witnessing a much larger process in which old structures gradually stop providing the answers they once did, while new models are still being built. This interval between the old and the new is usually the most unstable period of any major historical cycle, precisely because two different realities coexist at the same time. And perhaps this is the most important aspect of this entire analysis so far. When we look only at an isolated event, everything seems to be the result of specific decisions or momentary circumstances. But when we bring together all these movements, technological changes, economic transformations, the reorganization of international alliances, the revision of power structures, and the shift in public trust, a much broader picture begins to emerge. A picture that suggests we are living not just in a time of change, but in a change of era. There is a pattern of behavior that repeats itself in practically every major period of transformation in human history. First, reality changes. Then slowly people begin to notice this change. Only much later do headlines appear confirming what had already been happening quietly behind the scenes. This reversal in the order of events leads many people to believe that certain crises appeared suddenly, when in fact they had been building up for years. It was precisely this realization that became most evident during this analysis. The impression I got is that we are entering a period in which what has remained hidden for a long time will find it increasingly difficult to stay concealed. I'm not just referring to political scandals, confidential documents, or investigations. I'm talking about something much bigger. I'm referring to the trend of entire systems beginning to reveal weaknesses that they previously managed to disguise with ease. For decades, many structures survived because they were seen as permanent. Few people questioned how they operated. Few imagined that certain models could be replaced. However, when a historical cycle begins to come to an end, what once seemed solid no longer inspires the same confidence. Questions increase, demands intensify, and information that was previously ignored starts to receive attention. Small events that would previously have been forgotten start to trigger much greater consequences. It's important to understand that major revelations rarely appear as a single explosive event. Most of the time, they happen in stages. First, a piece of information emerges that is considered secondary. Next, a document, a leak, or a fact appears that expands on that initial story. Then, new pieces start to fit together, allowing people to see a picture completely different from the one they thought they knew. When this happens repeatedly across various sectors at the same time, it creates a collective sense that the world is being forced to reconsider many of its own certainties. This dynamic can reach governments, large companies, financial institutions, international organizations, and even public figures who, for a long time, built reputations considered unquestionable. It doesn't mean that all of them will face crises. It simply means that the environment tends to become much less tolerant of things that remain hidden. Transparency stops being just a distinguishing factor and becomes a necessity to maintain credibility. Another aspect that deserves attention is the speed at which these revelations can spread. A few years ago, certain pieces of information would take weeks or months to gain international attention. Today, it only takes a few hours for local events to cause financial, diplomatic, and political impacts in different parts of the world. This acceleration completely changes the way crises are managed. Often, the problem is no longer just the event itself, but the speed at which it reaches millions of people. This change creates an extremely sensitive environment for markets, governments, and companies. An unexpected announcement can alter stock markets. A political decision can provoke immediate international reactions. A technological breakthrough can render entire sectors obsolete within a few years. What was once considered a distant risk now produces concrete consequences almost instantly. That is why I believe that one of the main challenges of this new cycle will be precisely learning how to deal with a world in which information circulates faster than institutions can respond to it. When observing this scenario, another characteristic also began to appear quite clearly. It will not be only hidden information that tends to emerge. Many contradictions accumulated over recent years may become increasingly difficult to manage. Economic models that were already showing signs of wear may face greater pressures. Political strategies once considered effective may no longer produce the same results. Companies that grew relying exclusively on certain business models may find that the market has changed more quickly than they imagined. This happens because major historical cycles tend to change not only events, but also people's expectations. What was accepted in the past may no longer be sufficient in the future. Consumers change their habits, investors change their priorities, workers seek new ways of working. Governments need to respond to demands that are completely different from those they faced just a few years earlier. When all these changes happen simultaneously, it becomes inevitable that old contradictions will surface with greater intensity. There is also a detail that I find especially interesting. In periods like this, many revelations do not occur because someone decided to expose certain information. They happen simply because the environment has changed. New technologies allow access to data that was previously inaccessible. Artificial intelligence tools accelerate complex analyses. Investigations become more efficient. Global communication networks connect people who previously would never have exchanged information with each other. In other words, technological evolution itself increases society's ability to see what used to remain invisible. This transformation does not need to be seen only as a cause for concern. Every revelation also creates an opportunity for correction. Whenever a weakness becomes known, the possibility arises to rebuild more efficient structures. History shows that major institutional advances have often emerged precisely after old problems could no longer be ignored. That is why periods of exposure tend to be uncomfortable but also profoundly transformative. As I reflected on all these factors, I kept thinking about how many times humanity has interpreted major changes merely as a series of isolated crises. Only years later did it become clear that those events marked the beginning of a much larger reorganization. Perhaps we are living through exactly one of these moments, a period in which different sectors seem to be facing difficulties, not because everything is simply getting worse, but because old ways of operating are being put to the test in the face of an entirely new reality. If this interpretation is correct, the coming years will not be remembered only for the events that take place, but for the speed with which old certainties will give way to new models of organization. And the further this process advances, the more evident it will become that understanding the patterns behind these transformations will be much more important than simply keeping up with each individual piece of news. It is precisely in this direction that the next stage of this analysis leads us, because there is a factor capable of accelerating all these changes even more profoundly: the technological revolution and the advancement of artificial intelligence. After observing how governments, economies, and technologies seem to be heading toward a profound reorganization, I began to pay attention to an aspect that often receives less attention, but which may be one of the most important of all. No major historical transformation happens only within institutions. Before a new model of society can take hold, a silent change occurs within people themselves. It is there that old certainties begin to lose their strength and new ways of seeing reality start to emerge. When this happens, the first reaction is usually confusion. Many people feel that they no longer identify with environments where they have spent years. Others begin to question professional choices, friendships, relationships, or projects that once seemed absolutely right. There are also those who notice a growing desire to reduce the excess of information, slow down, and better understand what truly makes sense in their lives. These movements may seem individual, but when they start happening simultaneously to millions of people, they stop being just personal decisions and begin to reflect a collective change. It was exactly this pattern that caught my attention the most. In different parts of the world, there is a growing interest in self-knowledge, philosophy, spiritual life, emotional health, and quality of life. Not because these topics are new, but because the speed of external changes makes many people feel the need to also strengthen their internal structure. The more unstable the surrounding environment becomes, the greater the search tends to be for references capable of offering balance. This explains why so many practices related to personal development have gained ground in recent years. Regardless of the spiritual tradition each person follows, a common movement can be observed. There is a growing interest in better understanding one's own mind, developing emotional intelligence, strengthening intuition, and learning how to deal with a rapidly changing world. In other times, these issues occupied a secondary place. Today, they are becoming increasingly present precisely because reality demands a much greater capacity for adaptation. Another important detail is that this awakening rarely happens in a comfortable way. Almost always, it begins when we realize that old patterns no longer work as they used to. What brought security for years may stop producing the same results. People who have built entire careers within certain models now need to learn new skills. Established companies discover that the market has changed. Families begin to face challenges different from those experienced by previous generations. In other words, external change forces each individual to also review their own internal structures. While reflecting on this process, I realized that there is a fundamental difference between information and awareness. Information can be accumulated quickly. Today, anyone can access millions of pieces of content in just a few seconds. Awareness, however, requires something completely different. It arises from the ability to interpret, relate facts, develop discernment, and make more mature decisions in the face of reality. It is precisely this difference that may separate those who will be able to get through this period with more balance from those who will remain trapped by an excess of stimuli. We live in a time when practically everything is competing for our attention. News arrives without interruption. Social networks present new trends daily. Artificial intelligence produces content at a speed never seen before. In this environment, maintaining mental clarity may become one of the most important skills in the coming years. Not because it is necessary to ignore the world, but because it will become increasingly difficult to distinguish what truly matters from what merely triggers momentary emotional reactions. This phenomenon also directly influences the way people build their convictions. For a long time, opinions were formed based on just a few sources of information. Today, the scenario is completely different. Each individual receives thousands of stimuli every day from different countries, cultures, and perspectives. This broadens horizons, but it also significantly increases the challenge of developing critical thinking. In such a complex environment, the ability to reflect before reacting becomes an extremely valuable asset. Another aspect that I find especially significant is that periods of transformation often reveal talents that had remained dormant. Many people discover new callings precisely when they are forced to abandon paths that once seemed definitive. Others find opportunities where they previously saw only difficulties. History shows that major cycles of change do not produce only losses. They also create space for innovation, creativity, and growth in areas that previously received little attention. This does not mean that the transition is simple. On the contrary, whenever old structures give way to new possibilities, there is a period marked by uncertainty. It is during this time that doubts, fears, and even the feeling that everything is happening too fast arise. However, when we look at major transformations of the past, we see that almost all of them went through similar phases before a new balance was established. Perhaps this is exactly the main message of this moment. We are not facing a reality that only demands quick answers. We are facing a scenario that requires an evolution in the way we think, make decisions, and interpret the world. Those who try to face today's challenges using only models built for another era may encounter increasing difficulties. On the other hand, those who develop flexibility, the ability to learn, and a willingness to understand these transformations tend to go through this period much better prepared. By bringing all these elements together, it becomes increasingly clear that the major change will not happen only in governments, economies, or technologies. It will also happen within people. And perhaps it is precisely this silent transformation, almost imperceptible at first, that will determine how each individual will experience the coming years. Because when a new historical cycle begins, it is not just the world around us that changes. The way we choose to occupy our place within it also changes. Upon reaching this point in the analysis, a question naturally began to arise. If institutions are changing, if technology is redefining the economy, and if people themselves are undergoing a process of transformation, what will happen to the balance among the great nations? Because history shows that every major internal change ends up producing external consequences. No country remains exactly in the same position when the entire world begins to reorganize its priorities. It was then that I noticed a rather interesting pattern. For a long time, the international order operated with relative predictability. There were countries considered undisputed leaders in certain sectors, regions that wielded almost automatic influence, and alliances that seemed permanent. Today, this stability is beginning to be replaced by a much more dynamic scenario. Not because the great powers are disappearing, but because new centers of influence are emerging at an increasingly rapid pace. This difference is fundamental. We are not necessarily witnessing the end of one power and the rise of another. We are observing a world where different countries are starting to compete for prominence simultaneously. This makes negotiations more complex, increases economic competition, and demands much greater diplomatic capacity than existed a few decades ago. Just look at some recent developments. Countries are investing heavily in reindustrialization. Production chains are beginning to be redistributed. The pursuit of energy autonomy is becoming a priority. Governments are trying to reduce dependencies considered dangerous. Companies are seeking to diversify their suppliers. These moves may seem like merely economic decisions, but when analyzed together, they reveal a much larger strategy, preparing each nation for a less predictable international environment. Another aspect that caught my attention was the speed with which new players are starting to gain ground. In different regions of the world, countries that previously had limited influence have begun to occupy strategic positions in discussions about technology, spiritual energy, trade, and security. This completely changes the logic of international relations. Instead of a few players setting virtually all the rules, a much more distributed environment emerges, where various interests need to be reconciled at the same time. This reorganization naturally increases the number of diplomatic disputes. And here there is an important detail. When we talk about international disputes, many people immediately think of military conflicts. However, much of today's competition takes place in much more subtle ways. It happens through investments, trade agreements, technological dominance, cultural influence, logistical control, access to strategic minerals, and scientific innovation capacity. In many cases, these disputes produce effects as profound as a conventional war, but without a single shot being fired. It was precisely this characteristic that led me to see the coming years in a different light. Perhaps the main battlefield of this new cycle is not at physical borders, but in production chains, digital networks, financial markets, and technological development. Whoever controls these areas will have enormous power to influence global decisions, regardless of the size of their territory. At the same time, another factor that cannot be ignored is growing: the competition for resources considered essential for the future. Water, energy, food, rare minerals, digital infrastructure, and data storage capacity are becoming strategic assets of increasing value. The more technology advances, the greater the need for these resources becomes as well. This explains why certain regions of the planet are now receiving much more international attention than they did before. There is also an extremely relevant economic consequence. For many years, the globalization process created highly integrated production chains. Companies used to manufacture components in dozens of different countries, seeking maximum efficiency. Today, a somewhat different trend can be observed. Security and continuity of supply are becoming as important as production costs. In other words, governments and companies are beginning to accept paying more in exchange for greater stability. This shift could profoundly change international trade in the coming decades. While analyzing these trends, another issue started to gain traction. The traditional concept of world leadership may be undergoing a redefinition. In the past, to lead meant primarily to possess economic or military superiority. Now, leadership also depends on the ability to develop innovation, attract talent, protect digital infrastructure, form strategic alliances, and respond quickly to unexpected changes. It is a form of leadership much more based on adaptation than merely on strength. This transformation also has effects on financial markets. Investors no longer look only at traditional economic indicators and begin to consider institutional stability, technological capability, legal security, and innovation potential. This means that countries capable of building environments favorable to development will be able to attract opportunities that were previously concentrated in just a few regions. However, every reorganization of power also generates periods of tension. Whenever new players begin to occupy space, those who already held influence seek to preserve their positions. This process is part of the very dynamics of history. It does not necessarily mean that we will see inevitable confrontations, but it indicates that international negotiations tend to become more intense, more complex, and at many times more unpredictable. Perhaps it is precisely this unpredictability that will be the main feature of the coming years. Not because the world is heading toward permanent chaos, but because old rules are gradually ceasing to explain a completely new reality. Models that worked for decades are beginning to lose their effectiveness. New alliances emerge and strategic interests change rapidly. Countries that once moved forward together may now go in different directions, while former rivals find areas of cooperation in specific fields. When all these factors are observed together, it becomes hard to believe that we are simply experiencing a sequence of independent events. The impression that remains is that humanity is going through one of the greatest redistributions of power in recent generations. A redistribution that will not be defined solely by who has the most wealth or the most weaponry, but above all by those who are able to understand most quickly the new rules that are beginning to shape this century. And perhaps it is precisely here that this entire analysis finds its most important point, because after examining technology, economics, human behavior, and geopolitics, only one question remains. How could all of this influence the coming years? Which trends truly have the potential to define this new historical cycle? It is exactly this long-term perspective that we will explore in the conclusion of this analysis. I've noticed that there is a very common mistake when we try to imagine the future. Most people believe that the future will be defined by a single major event. People expect a specific election, a financial crisis, a war, a scientific discovery, or any event capable of single-handedly explaining everything that will happen afterward. But history rarely works that way. The periods that truly changed humanity were never the result of just one event. They were born from the convergence of several processes that evolved simultaneously until they reached a point where the world simply could no longer return to what it once was. That is exactly the feeling that remains after completing this investigation. I did not find a single factor responsible for the transformations we are experiencing. What I found was a set of changes that seem to be advancing in perfect harmony. Technology accelerates, the economy reorganizes, the balance among international powers shifts, people's behavior changes, and the ways of generating wealth evolve. The very way we interpret reality begins to be reconstructed. Individually, each of these movements could be seen as just another historical trend. Together, they reveal something much greater. Perhaps we are reaching the end of a development model that has supported much of the last century. This does not mean that everything will disappear at once. On the contrary, major cycles usually do not end with an absolute break. They end slowly while a new model grows alongside the old one until it becomes dominant. That is precisely why periods of transition tend to cause so much uncertainty. For a while, two different realities coexist. The old one no longer responds in the same way, while the new one has not yet fully consolidated. By observing this dynamic, I noticed another extremely important aspect. Many of the opportunities that will define the coming years probably do not yet exist in the way we imagine. Just remember how many current professions were not even considered 20 years ago. How many companies that are now considered giants simply did not exist. How many technologies once seemed impossible and today are part of the daily lives of millions of people. This shows that trying to predict the future by simply repeating patterns from the past may be one of the biggest mistakes we can make. Another factor that will likely have enormous influence is the speed of adaptation. At other times in history, people, companies, and governments had decades to react to changes. Now the interval between one transformation and the next is becoming ever shorter. Those who are slow to understand a new scenario may find it extremely difficult to make up for lost time. This applies to national economies, financial markets, education, innovation, and also to individual decisions. As I reflected on all this, another question began to arise. What really sets apart societies that thrive from those that remain stuck in difficulties? The answer seems to be less related to the resources available and much more to the capacity for adaptation. Throughout history, various civilizations possessed greater wealth, territory, and military power than their competitors. Even so, they disappeared because they insisted on preserving models that no longer responded to new circumstances. Others, much smaller, grew precisely because they quickly understood the changes and had the courage to forge different paths. This pattern remains extremely relevant today. Countries capable of investing in knowledge, research, infrastructure, and innovation tend to expand their influence. Companies that learn to use new technologies without abandoning the human factor will likely gain a competitive advantage. Professionals willing to learn continuously will find opportunities where others see only difficulties. In other words, the true differentiator in this new cycle may not be strength, but the capacity for evolution. There is still an element that I consider decisive and that often goes unnoticed. Whenever the world goes through major transformations, the importance of cooperation also increases. No country can face challenges related to technology, spiritual energy, climate, digital security, or economic stability alone. At the same time that international competition is increasing, it becomes inevitable to expand mechanisms for dialogue and coordination. This coexistence between competition and cooperation will probably be one of the most striking characteristics of the coming years. I also believe that we will see profound changes in the way success is measured. For a long time, economic growth was practically the only indicator used to assess development. Gradually, other factors are starting to gain importance. Quality of education, capacity for innovation, sustainability, institutional stability, mental health, technological security, and quality of life. This shows that the concept of prosperity tends to become much broader than it was before. By bringing together all these observations, one conclusion began to gain strength. The greatest challenge in the coming years may not be to predict exactly what the next major event will be. The real challenge will be to quickly understand the patterns that are transforming the world before these changes become obvious to everyone. Those who are able to identify trends while they are still emerging usually have much greater adaptability than those who only react once the transformations have already taken hold. That is precisely why I consider this an extraordinary time to be alive. Yes, there will be challenges, there will be moments of uncertainty, there will be difficult decisions in different parts of the world, but there will also be unprecedented opportunities for innovation, growth, and human development. Great historical cycles never produce only losses. They also create possibilities that previous generations could not even imagine. Perhaps a few decades from now, when people look back, they will realize that this was the moment when humanity quietly began to write a new chapter in its history. A chapter in which technology, knowledge, adaptation, and awareness came to define the course of nations and individuals much more than the old structures that dominated the last century. And that is precisely why paying close attention to these signs may be one of the most important decisions of our time, because the future rarely arrives all of a sudden. It begins much earlier, in a discreet, almost imperceptible way. And when everyone finally realizes that a new era has begun, it is usually already well underway. There is a conclusion that has become impossible to ignore. For a long time, we believed that history advanced in a linear, almost predictable way. Changes were gradual, models remained relatively stable, and there was a sense of continuity from one generation to the next. Today, that perception seems increasingly distant from reality. What we are witnessing is a period in which different transformations are happening simultaneously, accelerating each other and producing a scenario that few generations have had the opportunity to experience. Perhaps that is precisely why so many people feel like they are living in a world completely different from the one just 10 or 15 years ago. It's not just about the speed of technology, political changes, or economic transformations. It is the combination of all these factors happening at the same time that creates this impression of rupture. When several structures begin to change simultaneously, we are not simply facing a system update. We are witnessing the construction of a new reality. Throughout this analysis, we have observed how old forms of power are beginning to be questioned, how new technologies are altering the international balance, how economies are reorganizing, and how people themselves are starting a process of re-evaluating values, priorities, and expectations. Individually, each of these movements would already be significant, but when they all converge in the same direction, they become one of the greatest indicators that a new historical cycle is truly taking shape. This does not mean that the future is completely defined. On the contrary, one of the most fascinating aspects of periods like this is precisely the fact that different paths remain possible. The decisions made by governments, companies, institutions, and especially by individuals will have enormous influence on how this new stage will be built. Great historical cycles present trends, but they do not completely eliminate the human ability to choose their own paths. This may be the biggest difference between simply observing daily events and analyzing long-term patterns. The news shows the present, patterns reveal the direction. Those who look only at an isolated event may believe that everything happens by chance. But when we connect dozens of different movements, we realize that there is a much greater logic driving the transformation of society. I also believe that one of the biggest mistakes would be to interpret this moment solely through fear. Whenever humanity has faced profound changes, extremely pessimistic predictions have emerged. There were those who believed that certain inventions would completely destroy civilization. Others imagined that economic crises would mean the definitive end of certain countries. However, history shows that periods of transition usually produce both challenges and opportunities at the same time. The difference has almost always been in the ability to adapt. Those who realize early on that the scenario has changed usually start preparing before most people. They learn new skills, develop new strategies, and identify opportunities that are invisible to those who remain stuck in old models. On the other hand, those who insist on believing that everything will return exactly to how it was before end up facing greater difficulties when they realize that reality has taken a different path. It was precisely this reflection that stayed with me the most after completing this investigation. Perhaps the greatest asset in the coming years will not be money, technology, or political influence. Perhaps it will be the ability to quickly understand a world that will continue to change at an ever-increasing speed. Information will continue to be abundant, but discernment, balance, and strategic vision will likely become much more valuable resources than we imagine today. There is still one detail that I consider fundamental. Every time humanity has gone through major changes, there have been people who could see only the difficulties and others who were also able to perceive the possibilities. Both observed the same events, but came to completely different conclusions. This shows that the future does not depend solely on the external scenario. It also depends on how each individual chooses to interpret and respond to the changes they encounter along the way. Perhaps that is precisely why this moment deserves so much attention, Not because anyone can claim to know all the events that are yet to come, but because the signs already before us clearly indicate that old structures continue to lose strength while new forms of organization are beginning to take their place. The question no longer seems to be whether this transformation will continue to happen. The real question becomes how prepared we will be to live within this new reality. 20 or 30 years from now, when historians analyze this period, perhaps they will not choose a single event as the turning point of change. It is possible that they will point precisely to this decade as the moment when several different processes began to converge. The revolution of artificial intelligence, the geopolitical reorganization, the economic transformation, the redefinition of supply chains, the search for new sources of spiritual energy, and the change in the way people work, learn, and interact. Today, we are still experiencing these events in real time. This makes it difficult to grasp the full extent of what is happening, but history usually reveals its logic only when we look back. And perhaps in the future, it will become clear that this was the era in which humanity quietly underwent one of the greatest paradigm shifts since the Industrial Revolution. That is why, more important than trying to predict every headline that will appear tomorrow, is developing the ability to recognize the patterns that are already forming before our eyes, because the future rarely announces its arrival with a single major event. It usually emerges quietly through small changes that, accumulated over time, end up completely transforming history. And perhaps that is exactly what we are witnessing right now. Not just a succession of extraordinary events, but the beginning of a new stage in human civilization. A stage that will be remembered not for a single isolated event, but for the profound transformation that changed the way the world works and the way each of us came to see our own future. When we think about technological revolutions, we usually imagine new cell phones, faster computers, more sophisticated artificial intelligence, or robots performing tasks that once depended exclusively on human labor. All of this is indeed part of the transformation we are experiencing. However, throughout this analysis, it became increasingly clear that this revolution goes far beyond the devices we use every day. The real impact does not lie in the machines themselves, but in the way they are shifting the balance of power between countries, companies, and even individuals. If we look at history, we will see that virtually all major world powers achieved that status because they mastered some decisive technology of their time. Some controlled maritime routes, others led the Industrial Revolution, and some developed military superiority or financial capability. Today, however, it seems that we are entering a completely different phase. The most hotly contested resource on the planet is no longer just oil, gold, or territory, it's information. Those who can produce, process, protect, and use information on a large scale now occupy a strategic position that few could have imagined just a few years ago. This shift explains why the technological race is no longer just a matter for private companies, but has become central to national strategies. It's no coincidence that governments are investing billions in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, satellites, digital security, and semiconductor production. These areas represent not just innovation, they represent sovereignty. A country that is completely dependent on technology produced by another becomes vulnerable in ways that, until recently, were almost unimaginable. That's precisely why I believe that one of the biggest disputes of this new era won't necessarily take place through traditional military confrontations. Much of it will happen quietly inside laboratories, research centers, technology companies, and intelligence systems. The competition is no longer just about conquering physical territories. It now involves control over the digital infrastructure that underpins virtually the entire global economy. Another extremely relevant aspect is that this transformation changes the very definition of wealth. For a long time, having large natural reserves was enough to guarantee a competitive advantage. Today, that's still important, but it's no longer enough. Countries that are able to develop knowledge, innovation, and technology begin to create wealth that doesn't directly depend on the resources found within their territory. This shift profoundly changes the dynamics of the international economy and explains why so many nations are reformulating their education, research, and development policies. At the same time, a consequence arises that few people notice. The greater society's technological dependence, the greater its vulnerability to failures, cyber attacks, infrastructure disruptions, or information manipulation. In other words, every advance brings with it new opportunities, but also new risks. Technology expands extraordinary capabilities, but it also demands levels of protection that humanity has never before needed to develop on such a broad scale. While analyzing this scenario, another question began to appear repeatedly. Artificial intelligence may be just the first major symbol of this transformation, not its endpoint. Today, we talk about algorithms capable of producing texts, creating images, analyzing data, or automating processes. However, a few years from now, we may look back at this phase the same way we look at the first personal computers today, as the beginning of something much bigger. We are witnessing the first chapters of a change that will likely continue to evolve for decades. This also helps explain why so many professions are beginning to undergo adaptation processes. In different sectors, repetitive tasks tend to be automated, while creativity, analytical skills, and complex decision-making are increasingly valued. It does not necessarily mean there will be less work. It means that the type of work will continue to change rapidly. The skills required today may be quite different from those needed 5 or 10 years from now. There is also a less visible but equally important consequence. Technology changes the way societies build trust. In the past, most information circulated through just a few channels. Nowadays, anyone can produce content, influence millions of people, and participate directly in shaping public opinion. This democratizes access to information, but it also significantly increases the difficulty of distinguishing facts, interpretations, manipulations, and strategic interests. The struggle is no longer just about controlling territories, but also about controlling narratives. This environment creates an extremely complex scenario for governments, companies, and citizens. We have never had access to so much information and, paradoxically, it has never been so important to develop critical thinking skills to interpret what we receive daily. An abundance of data does not guarantee understanding. On the contrary, in many cases it can lead to confusion, information overload, and difficulty in distinguishing what truly deserves attention from what merely takes up space. There is yet another point that I find particularly interesting. Whenever humanity has gone through major technological revolutions, there have always been extremely optimistic predictions as well as deeply pessimistic ones. Some believed that everything would quickly improve. Others imagined only scenarios of collapse. Historical reality tends to follow a middle path. New technologies solve old problems, but they also create entirely new challenges. That is precisely why periods like this require balance, adaptation, and the ability to understand transformations before reacting to them impulsively. In my view, this process does not represent just a technological change. It represents a reorganization of the very structure of power on the planet. Countries that quickly understand this transformation will be able to expand their international influence. Those who are slow to adapt may find it increasingly difficult to compete in an environment that is ever more based on knowledge, innovation, and speed of response. And it is precisely at this point that all this analysis begins to take on an even greater dimension, because technology, economics, and geopolitics are not changing independently of each other. They seem to be part of the same historical movement, a movement that redefines who leads, who influences, and who is able to adapt to the new rules that are beginning to emerge. The question that remains is how this reorganization will directly affect relations between the major powers and which regions of the world may gain or lose prominence in the coming years.